breaking just now, Maduro, the president says, has been captured. Nicolás Maduro, president of Venezuela, has been captured, says President Trump. There will be a news conference at Mar-a-Lago on this at 11 a.m. Eastern time. Let me read you the full statement from the president. Quote, the United States of America has successfully carried out a large-scale strike against Venezuela and its leader, President Nicolás Maduro, who has been, along with his wife, captured and flown out of the country. This operation was done in conjunction with the U.S. law enforcement. Details to follow. There will be a news conference today at 11 a.m. at Mar-a-Lago. Thank you for your attention to this matter. President Donald J. Trump.
This video contains political commentary and analysis based on publicly available information, legal interpretations, and personal opinion. It does not claim definitive legal judgment or insider knowledge. Viewers are encouraged to consult primary sources and form their own conclusions. History has a way of revealing not just what people believe, and more importantly, when they abandon those beliefs because the wrong person acted on them. The reaction of American liberal progressive circles to President Trump's January 2026 capture of Nicolás Maduro is a textbook example of this phenomenon. For years, progressives in Congress, in media, and in activist spaces described Nicolás Maduro as a dictator, a human rights abuser, a narco-criminal, and an illegitimate ruler who had plunged Venezuela into famine, regression, and mass exile. They supported sanctions. They applauded indictments. Many openly called for Maduro's removal after his 2020 U.S. indictment for narco-terrorism. Yet, the moment Maduro was finally removed, not by diplomacy, not by press releases, but by decisive action, those same voices pivoted instantly to moral condemnation of tyranny, to procedural outrage, from solidarity with Venezuelans to abstract lectures about norms, optics, and precedent. This reversal is not principled, it is political, and Venezuelans know it. First, there is the central moral failure, ignoring the people who actually lived under Maduro. The most glaring flaw in progressive opposition is its near-total disregard for Venezuelans themselves. Across Venezuela and throughout the diaspora, from Miami to Madrid, Bogota to Buenos Aires, Venezuelans celebrated the capture of the man who destroyed their country. These are not naive people intoxicated by American propaganda. These are refugees, dissidents, former political prisoners, families of the disappeared, and citizens who survived hyperinflation, food rationing, blackouts, and state terror. Progressive critics insist they care deeply about Venezuela, yet they dismiss the voices of Venezuelans as inconvenient, emotional, or insufficiently nuanced. Instead, they elevate the opinions of American academics, NGO professionals, and congressional staffers who have never stood in a bread line or watched soldiers seize their neighborhoods. By the way, this is not solidarity, it is paternalism. They believe that enlightened Western progressives understand Venezuelan interests better than Venezuelans themselves. And this is what we colloquially refer to as progressive savior complex. Secondly, there is the selective legalism of the international law argument. Progressives argue that Trump's action violated international law and sovereignty. This claim collapses under scrutiny. 1. Sovereignty is not absolute. International law does not grant unlimited protection to leaders who are indicted for transnational crimes, run narco states that export violence, are not recognized as legitimate heads of state, and act as criminal enterprises rather than governments. The U.S. has long maintained, and progressives have often supported, the principle that criminal regimes forfeit certain sovereign protections. Maduro was indicted in 2020. Progressives applauded that indictment. What exactly did they think it meant? An indictment is not a moral statement. It is a legal claim that demands enforcement. 2. UN approval has never been the progressive standard. Yeah, progressives did not demand UN Security Council authorization for Kosovo in 1999, or Libya in 2011 after scope creep, or for counter-ISIS operations or targeted killings of terrorist leaders. Why? Because they understood that veto-reading UN structures are often paralyzed by authoritarian powers like Russia and China, the very regimes that propped up Maduro. Now, to suddenly elevate UN permission as sacrosanct is historical revisionism, not legal consistency. Progressives argue that diplomacy, sanctions, and internal reform were preferable. This argument borders on the delusional. Diplomacy had already failed. 2 decades of negotiations failed. Sanctions failed to dislodge Maduro. Electoral processes were rigged. Opposition leaders were jailed, exiled, or murdered. International mediators were manipulated. At what point does diplomacy become an excuse for inaction? Progressive rhetoric treats diplomacy as morally superior regardless of outcome. But diplomacy that leaves a tyrant in power while millions flee is not moral. It's comfortable. 4. The imperialism accusation and the oil obsession. So, the charge that Trump acted out of imperialism or oil greed is one of the weakest and most cynical arguments offered. Progressives have reduced Venezuela to a resource abstraction, ignoring Maduro's transformation of oil revenue into cartel financing, the collapse of Venezuela's oil infrastructure under corruption, the role of oil in sustaining repression, not prosperity. Ironically, many of the same progressives accusing Trump of colonialism supported Chinese debt trap agreements, Russian military assistance, Iranian oil for weapons schemes in Venezuela. Apparently, exploitation is only immoral when Americans do it openly, rather than authoritarians doing it covertly. Five, there is the misapplication of the war powers argument, that is, domestic authority. The claim that Trump violated the war powers resolution misunderstands both the law and the operation. This was not a war declaration, it was a law enforcement-centered capture operation grounded in existing federal indictment, executive authority under Article 2, protection of U.S. personnel, and the president's duty to execute federal law. C. Progressives did not object when presidents conducted extraterritorial raids, captured or killed indicted terrorists, and used force short of war declarations. The distinction here is not legal, it is personal, because Trump did it. Six, the fear-mongering about destabilization. Progressives warn of chaos, civil war, and refugee crisis, yet ignoring that Venezuela was already destabilized and refugees were already fleeing. Maduro's removal eliminated the primary source of repression. This argument assumes tyrants are stabilizing forces. History proves the opposite. Tyranny does not prevent collapse. It delays it while increasing the human cost. Seven, the deep hypocrisy from Maduro must go to not like this. Perhaps the most damning indictment of progressive opposition is this. They wanted Maduro gone, just not at the cost of their moral self-image. They wanted someone else to take the risk, someone else to get blamed, someone else to act decisively. So when Trump did what they rhetorically demanded but never intended to enforce, they recoiled. Not because it was wrong, but because it exposed the emptiness of their prior condemnations. Eight, the savior complex and the erasure of agency.
Come celebrate with us. We love everybody because you, America, has loved us so much. So much. Thank you, America.
Edgar, thank you so much for sharing those sentiments. Guys, this is something.
¡Que viva Venezuela libre! ¡Viva! ¡Sí se pudo! ¡Sí se pudo!
Progressives imagine themselves as guardians of Venezuelan democracy, yet deny Venezuelans agency when their response contradicts progressive ideology. They lecture Venezuelans on long-term consequences, historical patterns, geopolitical nuance. But Venezuelans do not need lectures, they need freedom. This is the savior complex in its purest form, performative concern without accountability for results. 9. Congress and the theater of moral protest. The loudest congressional critics are not offering solutions, they are staging virtue performances. They offer no credible alternative path, accept no responsibility for past failures, bear no cost for endless delay, exploit legal abstractions while ignoring human reality. Their outrage is safe because it's consequence-free. 10. Here is the uncomfortable truth. The capture of Nicolás Maduro shattered a progressive illusion that history can be managed indefinitely through statements, sanctions, and symbolism. Sometimes reality demands action, and when it does, those most invested in moral theater are often the first to condemn it. Not because it failed, but because it succeeded without them. Venezuelans are celebrating because the nightmare ended, but progressives are protesting because their narrative collapsed. And history will remember which side cared more about outcomes than optics, freedom than form, and people over posture. 11. The strategic reality progressives refuse to face. Hemispheric security in a new Cold War. There is one final benefit of Nicolás Maduro's removal that progressive critics almost entirely refuse to acknowledge. Precisely because doing so will require confronting the uncomfortable truth that the world has entered a new era of great power conflict, and that moral posturing is no substitute for moral strategy. The Western Hemisphere is no longer insulated from global rivalry. It is a contested space, and Venezuela under Maduro was not merely a failed state or a humanitarian tragedy. It was a forward operating platform for America's adversaries. Venezuela as a strategic asset for America's enemies. Under Maduro, Venezuela became China's energy dependency node, supplying oil to fuel Beijing's industrial machine, Russia's geopolitical beachhead, hosting intelligence cooperation, military advisors, and strategic signaling operations, Iran's logistical partner facilitating sanctions evasion, weapons transfers, and ideological alignment. This was not theoretical. It was operational reality. China relied heavily on Venezuelan crude to hedge against maritime choke points and Western pressure. Russia used Venezuela as a symbol and instrument of hemispheric defiance, a way to demonstrate that the United States no longer control its own neighborhood. Iran exploited Venezuela's chaos to move money and material far closer to US borders than should ever have been tolerated. To pretend this was merely a regional issue is strategic malpractice. The Monroe Doctrine was never about nostalgia, it was about survival. When President Trump invoked the Monroe Doctrine, progressives scoffed, treating it as a relic. But doctrines endure not because they are old, but because the conditions they address persist. The Monroe Doctrine was never about empire. It was about preventing hostile foreign powers from embedding themselves in the Americas. In 2026, that threat is no longer hypothetical, it is active. Allowing Venezuela to remain a narco state aligned with China, Russia, and Iran would have meant accepting a permanent adversarial foothold in the Western Hemisphere, one that undermines US security, destabilizes regional allies, and weakens America's position globally. President Trump did not escalate conflict. He closed a strategic breach. Deterrence restored, not destabilization created. Critics warn that Trump's action risks escalation. In reality, it achieved the opposite. Decisive action restores deterrence. Ambiguity erodes it. By acting decisively, China is reminded that energy leverage has limits. Russia is shown that Western Hemisphere provocation carries consequences, and Iran loses a critical sanctions evasion partner. This was not recklessness, it was clarity. For years, America's adversaries tested boundaries precisely because they believed the United States had lost the will to enforce them. Maduro's capture sent a message not just to Caracas, but to Beijing, Moscow, and Tehran. The Western Hemisphere is not an abandoned theater. And here is the progressive strategic blind spot. Progressive opposition to this action reveals a profound strategic blind spot. They analyze global politics as if it were still 1995, where intentions matter more than power, and process matters more than outcomes. But this is not a post-Cold War world, it is a competitive one. China, Russia, and Iran do not interpret restraint as virtue, they interpret it as weakness. They do not respond to statements, they respond to consequences. By removing Maduro, President Trump disrupted a hostile alliance network, reduced adversarial access to critical resources, reasserted American leadership in its own hemisphere, strengthened the security architecture of the Americas. That is not imperialism, that is statecraft. This is a necessary act of leadership in an unforgiving world. President Trump's capture of Nicolás Maduro was morally justified, legally defensible, strategically sound, and geopolitically necessary. It liberated a nation from a tyrant. It honored the will of Venezuelans. It upheld the principle that criminal regimes are not untouchable. And it reaffirmed that the United States will not cede its hemisphere to hostile powers under the guise of moral paralysis. Progressives may continue to protest. They may invoke process, precedent, and abstract fears. But history does not judge nations by how carefully they avoided action. It judges them by whether they acted when it mattered. In January 2026, it mattered, and President Trump acted.